Welcome to Westminster. Welcome to Westminster. My name's Merlin Fulcher. I'm an architectural journalist and I'm joined by Peter Murray OBE.
Good morning, Merlin.
We're cycling from the centre of political power in London to Bank, the centre of the financial, you could say the economic power of the city. Peter, are you ready?
I'm ready.
So we're starting in Smith Square, outside the extraordinary St John Smith Square Church designed by Thomas Archer. What do you make of this one?
I think it's what we call now overdevelopment here, really, isn't it? This ought to be a green square for the people living here in Smith Square. Shouldn't actually be built on like this, should it?
Well, that's probably what people would say now. And maybe it was once a green square, and now it's a big old Baroque church in the middle of it. I quite like the history of this one because it sort of dates from the early 18th century. And it was a time when building new civic infrastructure was at the forefront of London's agenda. Today we're going to be looking at a lot of amazing new cycle infrastructure, but I think we need to see it very much in the kind of prism of a civic improvement. This church was a kind of spiritual upgrade for the city. It was one of 50 churches designed by the greatest architects of the time. Some of them designed Christopher Wren and others. The funds for it were raised by a tax on coal imports into the Port of London. So effectively taxing Google to pay for a new cycle lane. So pretty cool sentiment. I think we should revive that kind of spirit. Get the most high-tech thing of the age and make it pay. So we're coming up to Abingdon Street, which is part of a cycle superhighway. Is this one you're familiar with, Peter?
Yes, well, I was quite involved with the East-West cycle superhighway when Boris Johnson was mayor, actually, and I was on the Mayor's Design Advisory Group at the time, and so we helped advise on the aspects of the design of it, and also quite involved in, might say, the political debate surrounding it, which of course was very heated and went back quite a long way to thoughts about how Victoria Embankment could be used in a different way. Ken Livingstone supported the idea of a park on the embankment, and that was rather grander than what turned out to be a two-way cycle superhighway, which is actually, I think, really successful in terms of getting cyclists from one end of London here right through, you can go almost to Canary Wharf, actually, on a segregated route, which is fantastic.
But interesting, you're basically describing that you were part of this political commissioning process, almost like those people that commissioned that church and made those civic upgrades back then. We just had our opinion on that. Let's check out the cycle route and see what the results were.
Ah, well, it doesn't exist anymore because that was for Boris. It was an advisory group for Boris, and then for Sadiq Khan, he set up the Mayor's Design Advocates, which is 50 architects, designers, urbanists who advocate, I guess, good design, which is around good growth, which is the sort of focus of the London plan. And that involves not just cycling infrastructure as such, but more active travel, which is actually dealing with healthier streets that involve pedestrians as well as cyclists, and actually hopefully get them to, might say, work more considerately together on the streets rather than continually being in conflict.
So we're coming up to Parliament Square. Tell us a bit about the history of this one.
Well, Parliament Square, the idea of making it into a better sort of place started with a project that Richard Rogers showed at the Royal Academy in 1986. It was an exhibition that I organised with Dejan Sujic. Who was up until recently, the director of the Design Museum. And that Richard Rogers proposed this idea of pedestrianising Trafalgar Square, whole of Whitehall, Parliament Square here, and also, and we'll go past it later, a new bridge at Charing Cross. And the idea of world squares for all became something that Ken Livingstone championed, and that created a much improved Trafalgar Square that we have today. But unfortunately, the plans for Parliament Square here never actually happened.
Well, let's nip into the square here if we can, and demount I mean, you're saying that, so this exhibition at the Royal Academy was 35 years ago. But so this square itself, though, obviously this was a kind of civic improvement project from further beyond in the past. Was it in the sort of 1950s that it got most of its present shape?
Yeah, I mean, quite a bit of the area around here was damaged in the war, really, and so they got a chap called Wren, who is well known to architects because he designed their headquarters in Portland Place. Wren was asked to redesign it, and he created this different levels, protected edge to the top, but essentially he couldn't get out of the fact that it's just a bloody great roundabout, really.
One of the things that strikes me about this space is that you've got the Parliament here, like the power in the hands of the people. You've got the Westminster Abbey, the religion here. You've got the Supreme Court there, the judiciary, and over here you've got civil servants, the representing the executive. And yet, despite all of these conflicting interests, as you say, it was SUV drivers that stopped it from being pedestrianised. How much power do they have?
Yes, but also you have those two. You also have the royal family just up there across St James's Park. So you have this great triumvirate here, which is the centre of governance, and has been for a long time. In contrast to where we're going, which is the city, which was very often more powerful than the king because they held all the money. But the interesting thing is this area has never had a really coherent plan to it. They've always been looked at in very different ways, and I can remember back in I suppose mid-70s when the first plans for this building here, which were a firm of young architects. Their name was Spencer and Webster. They had an idea for creating a big open plaza, which would be accessible to everybody, and it would become a really sort of democratic square. And then there was a bomb in the car park of the Houses of Parliament, and that changed everything. So security has actually had a massive impact really on how this whole area is designed, and it took a long time really for, might say, the people who controlled security and city planners to start thinking along the same lines. And I can remember when we were doing the east-west cycleway here, there was some great big chunky bits of steel just on the corner here, and it was almost impossible to get the security people to understand that they needed to move a bit in order to be safer for cyclists. But that has all changed, particularly since the problems on London Bridge and Westminster Bridge, where as soon as that happened, these great ugly bits of steel were rolled out over the bridges, which are really hideous places, quite dangerous for cyclists too. And that meant that now everyone got together and started thinking we can do better. We can do better.
You made a really interesting point about the centre of power and royal power and the city over there. So we're going to continue our journey going on to the city. Now, once upon a time, this was the main route, along here, along the Strand. But we're going to go on the new best route between the city and the centre of power. We're going to go on this cycle CS3, yeah? So let's lead the way along here, and hopefully we can get along this. Yeah, let's go.
There are bikes coming in the other direction.
Let's go now. After you, please. So Peter, you've just been awarded an OBE for your extraordinary services to architectural heritage. You have a depth of understanding of change in this city, which is quite simply unparalleled. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about the embankment itself and how within your own career, within the sort of changes you've seen in our culture of public transport, of cycle transport, and sort of civic architecture, how that's all become realised in what we now will be experiencing today.
Well, I mean, I think the interesting about the embankment is, of course, it's one of the greatest civic pieces of infrastructure and engineering any city has ever seen, which was Bazalgette's embankment, which also has drainage underneath. It also has under there, it has the district tube line as well. And Richard Rogers, with his idea of the park, wanted to actually bury the road under there as well, along with the tube line, so that we could get rid of the traffic altogether. It would have made a fantastic improvement to the river's edge, because of course one of the things about cities is that rivers weren't things that people particularly liked back in when roads started to be built. So you would build busy roads along rivers, and you can see that in Paris as well as here, so because they were easy to build on, and this was sort of built out into the river, narrowing the river space. Well, we're about to go along the Strand, and the Strand was a strand like almost a beach, because the river was much didn't slope down quite so fast. There's a rise up to the Strand, and that was because it's on a sort of curve of the river. The river is wider and shallower, and so it was filled in to create, as I say, a new drain, new road, and you get this really very pleasant walkway as well. But
so if I'm hearing you right, Peter, that this creation in the mid-19th century is not just a tree-lined street. This is actually a kind of high-tech, cross-sectional bit of futuristic city infrastructure. It has a railway, it has a sewer in it, it also has a wall to stop this all from being flooded by the river. And yet they didn't put in a cycle lane back then?
Well, no, they didn't, because it's quite interesting that actually people now think that roads are built for cars, but actually smooth roads were actually built for cyclists. It was cyclists who campaigned to have smoother roads, and that was before cars came along. And of course, at the time when Bazalgette was building this, there would be horses and carts and all that sort of stuff, and so it was a very different movement. And when you were on a bicycle back in the 1870s or something, you didn't have you didn't have cars and things which would kill you in quite the same way as they do today. So the danger wasn't.
I quite like the idea that in 20 years' time, when cars don't really exist, we'll be discussing horse infrastructure and bicycle infrastructure and upselling cobbled streets, saying, oh, it's a real shame they got rid of them. Will cyclists and horses ever get along? Can we get a surface that unites the pair?
Well, but we might have autonomous vehicles, you never know.
Yeah.
And one of the problems we have at the moment is that everyone's being encouraged to go electric, and actually we don't really want the streets filled with more tin boxes. They might be electric, they might be less polluting, but they're still dangerous, and they're still things that don't mix well with cyclists.
No London. Oh, look at that beauty.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Before we move on,
yes, please.
One of the things that complicates it here is, of course, this is the Tideway Tunnel that they're building now, which is actually a new tunnel under the Thames. And that, might say, modernises Bazalgette's infrastructure here, because the problem with Bazalgette's infrastructure is that it mixes basically shit with stormwater.
Yes.
And now, these days, we're having more and more street flooding because of the rainfall caused by climate change, and we're putting masses of pollution into the Thames on a regular basis, when Bazalgette's system, which was actually built to expand, but not to the level it has to deal with today.
Yes.
It's putting all the shit into the river.
Oh, it's awful.
And I mean, one of the interesting things about it is that you think that the river's going out all the time, and if they do spill it in the river, it's going to go out to Tilbury or somewhere in a short period of time. But actually, the tide keeps it pretty much stuck in here for quite a long time. So it's not a good thing to have. So that what they're building here will take that effluent out in a safe way, but also, interesting enough, where they're doing this works will produce some new public spaces overlooking the river, which is great.
It's somewhat reassuring that Bazalgette's embankment infrastructure, unlike present buildings which are always pulled down and rebuilt entirely from scratch, this one, you can retrofit it. You can just add a new sewer on the side of it. You could add a cycle lane down the middle of it. It's kind of like refreshingly different for something that was built 150 years ago. Let's continue the quest east. I guess what is quite exciting about this Thames Tideway construction site is the long sort of legacy for this, is that it will become a civic public place. And
yes.
There's architects Hawkins Brown, actually the designers of the failed Parliament Square redesign.
That's right.
Have been commissioned to design these pocket parks that will sit atop the digging shafts,
yes.
and they will then in the future be little places where we can sit and pretend that we don't smell the vapours rising up beneath us. But Peter, you mentioned Richard Rogers. Now Richard Rogers, one of the great architects of the British high-tech movement, the architect of the Grade 1 listed Lloyd's building in the City of London. So just tell us a bit more about Richard Rogers' vision for this bit that we're on now. Would it have been a kind of giant park?
This would have been a giant park, as I was saying. He wanted to bury the road under here as well, just as Bazalgette had buried his drains under here. And so this was an idea he had,
yes.
and he showed it at the Royal Academy, and he had this wonderful model of the river,
yes.
with real water in it, circulating water, a little pump circulating the water, and he came up really innovative idea,
yes.
was that actually you don't need a train station at Charing Cross here.
Yes.
You could stop all the trains at Waterloo very easily.
The people from Kent would love that.
Well, what he wanted to do was to deliver a new walking bridge, a
yes.
bit more sophisticated than this, and you could actually go in little capsules across it if you didn't fancy walking.
Oh,
and,
yes, stunning.
So, as London does, as well as like Bazalgette's grand gestures, more often today we do small things. So this new bridge here isn't a small thing, but it's an addition to the old Hungerford Bridge, a really ugly bridge, and it has made it more elegant. But instead of taking Richard Rogers' radical view, we've kept the station at Charing Cross and added two little bridges either side.
Nip down the embankment place. It's certainly, if those of us with long memories will remember that Hungerford Bridge used to have a very pitiful and terrifying pedestrian layer bolted onto one
yes.
side that allowed
yes.
you to walk from the south bank over here. And you could sort of imagine that even though Richard Rogers' grand vision for a bridge was never realised, the present Hungerford Bridge pedestrian sections on either side does somewhat pay homage to his original vision.
Oh yes, absolutely. But also it does represent a real shift to making sure that pedestrian movement in the city is improved. And for a long time, cars were the only thing that people seemed to think had a sort of rite of passage through London, and that is changing. And I think this street, Villiers Street, is really interesting because we're cycling up it now. Normally it would be more crowded than it is today.
Yes, it's very quiet.
But this
Saturday.
This is a vehicular road, as we can see. There are lorries up there.
Yes.
But it works as a shared space because
yes.
the volume of pedestrians means that everyone, taxis and cyclists, just have to slow down. And I'm a great believer in the right places where you can have shared spaces where pedestrians and cyclists can share the space and can be considerate to each other.
I think what's very interesting, we've gone off that cycle superhighway 3 and the embankment, that kind of modernist infrastructure, even if it is a mishmash of 19th, 20th and 21st century. And we're now in this old streetscape of London, this shaped by the banks of the river, the Strand, the old English word for riverbank. So it's like a very different atmosphere, but like as you say, the gentleness is what shines through and creates it as a place for everyone. We're going to go right here.
Yes, well, I think that one of the benefits of smaller streets is that cars generally don't go quite so fast. You can actually share the road, and one of the things that we're not very good at, I think, is making sure that we clarify how streets should be used. The changes that have happened in London have been pretty substantial.
I'd like to point out just here, there's a really interesting tunnel on Lower Robert Street. This was actually somewhere I wanted to bring everyone today, but unfortunately it's closed to us, so we weren't able to cycle through it. But what this does is it kind of reflects on the verticality of this neighbourhood, because on one side you have the Strand, which is the old raised riverbank, and then over here you have the old shoreline of the River Thames. So there's a big step change, and the buildings, like we saw on Villiers Street, there's some really tall ones, and there's a sky bridge, and there's all this kind of three-dimensional stuff going on. Whereas normally in a city we don't really expect that. It's much more like Edinburgh than it is like London, this tiny little segment.
This little bit is, yes, absolutely. And you can find a trace of this in the building of the Royal Society of Art just up the street, but that's been turned into a cafe and conference suite. Yeah. Is that where the gate is?
But this is a bit like being in Edinburgh, and so this tunnel is part of a property development called the Adelphi. Yeah. And the Adelphi was built in the 1770s. And obviously you think that's a really old thing, but actually it was a kind of radical modernist kind of thing in its own time. It was put together by Robert Adam and his brother John Adam and William Adam. And they named it the Adelphi, which is also the Greek word for brothers. So it was like the kind of brothership development of its time. They obviously had done the Edinburgh New Town, which is a famous kind of piece of civic improvement architecture. Anyone who knows Edinburgh will be familiar with all its weird and winding passageways and tunnels. So this tunnel was actually part of many tunnels that once connected the Adelphi property development to the River Thames, a series of tunnels which became quite undesirable places during the late 19th century when industrialization saw a lot of dispossessed and displaced people homeless. So really none of them survived because they had quite a bad rep in the end. But the Adelphi itself is pretty glamorous these days. It's home to the Royal Society of Arts and some other swanky buildings that we're going to go and have a look at. And you'd expect it always had a high aspiration because it was inspired by Diocletian's palace in what is now Croatia and Split. So we're going to go over here and have a look.
Well, I think it's quite interesting that since we are having this ride the day after the England-Scotland match, was that the Adam brothers actually had bagpipers playing on site in order to keep their Scottish workers working really hard.
Bring it back. We're on pipers on all construction sites. A new health and safety feature. So here we are. So this is the kind of surviving elements of the Adelphi. And anyone who's travelled a lot around London, they kind of sort of get echoes of Portland Place and other sort of grand neighbourhoods, Bloomsbury. These homes were the kind of high-tech of their time. Big windows, high ceilings, fresh air, rational proportions, still admired as much now as they were in the past. Let's do a little loop around though. Let's really enjoy what the legacy of the Adelphi and its terraces. This is such a lovely building here. So we're coming up here, Ludgate Hill, and this is our epic journey between the centre of power in Westminster to the centre of finance in Bank, and we've come across our first road closed.
We've got 19% on the battery. I wonder if we should
I think we can possibly be allowed to cycle on this. Oh no, it's a film set. Oh, I can see a smart car. Maybe it's a James Bond. Okay, never fear. There's a cool way round here for bicycle. Canny cyclists can always find them.
Maybe it's Harrison Ford has come to London. I see he's been filmed cycling around the north of England recently. So,
well,
he's a keen cyclist.
He's a keen cyclist.
Ford.
Yes.
Now here we are, nice little benches here. These are new benches put in by the city to activate the streets.
Those are really lovely. So once upon a time, that was the preserve of illegal parking. So in 21st century London, it's totally legit to just dish out tinnitus to people, and the police don't seem to be doing anything about it.
But this area of Carter Village is another bit of space which somehow got forgotten for a long time, and that was quite good for it, because it's actually a really nice medieval street pattern which has not been changed, or it's been changed very little, and still you still get the feel of those medieval streets, which I think is very nice.
Yes. Little City of London visitor pavilion by Make Architects here. On the left, silvery thing, quite a sort of maybe a bit of a noughties way of doing this stuff.
Well, I think I like that. I like the idea that there is a contrast between the old and the new, and I think that's something which is rather nice about the city. I know you have reservations about the cluster of towers there, but I actually think the way that it marries in, you might say, with the more ancient part of the city, I think is great.
So past Christopher Wren St Paul's Cathedral on the left, just next to the St Paul's Cathedral is the St Paul's Choir School by Architects Co-Partnership. A really lovely building.
Yes.
Of its time, possibly a bit overlooked as one of London's great post-war bits of spiritual architecture or educational architecture. This is quite a cool building on the right. This one here.
Fascinating, really. I think it's designed by the more recent bit by Michael Hopkins and Partners. Really splendid piece of almost high tech, but almost feels too traditional to be real English high tech.
Yeah.
And
because of the stone, the sandstone, or
bit of stone.
Yeah.
And
it says here Bracken House. What a name, Bracken House. It looks strong.
It was the home of the Financial Times.
Yes.
In the post-war period.
Yes.
And is once again the home of the Financial Times now.
Oh, lucky journalist.
Because the building is owned by a Japanese property developer.
Yeah.
And of course now the Financial Times is owned by a Japanese publisher. So.
Oh, really?
The two things have come together and they've put them back into this building.
Yes, it feels like some sense of order and tradition has been restored to the world. The FT journalists are in their old home and it looking very nice.
Well, I think that's an absolutely London thing to happen. I'm a sort of Ackroydian, really,
Yes.
in terms of how I think about London. Peter Ackroyd's book, London, the biography, gives you a wonderful picture of the essence of the sort of personality of London is one that where things do keep repeating themselves, things come back. There are places where things happen that actually, even without us consciously realising it.
So if I was going to report that alarm going off, I'd use the telephone here to call up the police.
Yes.
On this post box here.
Well, there has just actually been a design competition for a new one of those, which obviously when that's put in, it'll work.
Phineas Harper leads the way. And he's off. Quite a suburban bit of garden there, but it's still nice to have it.
Well, it's a huge mix. Here we are. This was a high-tech building of its time, made of GRP. I don't know what style you'd call it, but I used to hate it. I've got sort of used to it now, and it does have a certain connection to the more Victorian, decorated Venetian Victorian, the other side of the street.
So that's a glass reinforced plastic, a bit like what you'd make a leisure boat out of.
That's
it's not concrete.
Exactly it.
It's not concrete, it's plastic.
And they had to do quite a lot of work to it. It wasn't quite as robust over time as they thought when they first put it in. And so you don't see many buildings like that anymore. But there were quite a lot of local authority towers built with them, particularly over in Tower Hamlets, using GRP, glass reinforced panels.
So this is Queen Victoria Street. This tells the story of architecture like nowhere else.
Well, and the city, because of course this was one of the big streets the Victorians cut through the medieval street plan, And so we see going off Bow Lane, little narrow streets like this, which are an essential part of the city. But this is a busy route, and now, of course, one of the things the City of London needs to do is sort of control this, so it is actually a decent space for pedestrians as well as cyclists.
Yes, beautiful.
And,
yeah.
and you know, one of the interesting things about the city is, of course, that when it's fully working, that actually there are so many people who are coming in at rush hour that the pavements just aren't big enough to cope with them, and you do start to get a sort of shift between pedestrians and motorists, where motorists actually have to give way to pedestrians just because the volume of people going to work is so great.
So we're coming up here. On our right is the Bloomberg building by Foster and Partners. On our left is Number One Poultry by Jim Sterling. And we're coming up to Bank Junction, a kind of extraordinary collision of different architectural styles, but also one of the most sort of distinctive and recognising and all-encompassing places, but also a place of quite contested transport modes.
Yeah, it is an amazing space because you've got cars, buses, lorries coming from all directions, so very tricky to navigate. And the City of London has had a plan for the last decade or so to actually turn it into a much more usable public space, because it is it's a, as you say, phenomenal conjunction of not just different architecture but all these key uses. You've got the Lord Mayor of London here and the Mansion House. Then you've got the Royal Exchange, which was the earliest market, financial and trading market that was happening in the city. You've got big banks here, and then of course just around the corner you can see the Bank of England. So this is a fantastic coming together of architecture, activity, of finance, and you know, it's just a horrible junction.
Well, yeah.
One of the interesting things about it is that I remember there's a chap called Michael Wellbank, who was the chairman of the planning committee here in the city, who really drove this, and he would always say that actually if this was in Germany it would never have worked, because people in Germany would respect the red light on the crossings. In the city nobody takes a blind bit of notice.
Pedestrians
and
or cyclists.
So pedestrians just going in every direction.
Yes.
And that meant it didn't totally clog up. If people obeyed the rules, it would have totally clogged up and never worked. And so, and also here there was a really terrible accident.
Let's let these buses go, and then we'll go more into the centre so we can get a good 360 on it.
There was a young Chinese graduate who was working in the city who was killed by a construction lorry turning left just next to the Royal Exchange.
That's
there.
horrific. That is very sad to hear.
That was dreadful. I came to the site with one of the city police to try and work out what had happened, and her family had just arrived from China, and it's the most tragic thing that I'd actually seen. And
I think one of the things is, obviously we're both kind of trained to look up. You know, we're architectural journalists, architects, but we always look up. But actually, a lot of people, you're going to come here and you're not going to immediately look up and admire this. You're going to look down, and what are you going to see? You're going to see loads of bollards, loads of weird traffic poles and lights and these yellow temporary things, and it's a bit overwhelming, isn't it?
Well, it's been a long campaign really to try and reduce urban clutter, but at the moment, obviously, it's pretty extreme. These temporary elements will go
by Wellington there.
And I'm trying to convince Transport for London to get a better substitute for these wands that we're seeing here. They're not very nice. They don't have any particular delightful aspect. They don't add any delight to the city.
So here we are. We've gone from Westminster to the Bank Junction, the political, from the political heart to the financial heart. We've got a bench, Subrimus by Pebble House. This is put here by LFA, a project strongly associated with Peter Murray. But yes, as you were saying, Bank Junction is in an interim state. It's going to be a lot better for pedestrians and cyclists.
It's going to be a lot better. There was a competition, and JR, the studio, we won the competition to reorganise this space, put some planting in, make it safer for cyclists, pedestrians. Buses, just buses will be allowed through between 7 a.m. 7 p.m. So it would reduce the amount of traffic, hopefully make this space just a little bit easier to use, more connected to the rest of the area. But I think the key thing is to stop people, stop the deaths really. The one death here that I came to very soon afterwards, but there is a major issue that they have in the city, that there are so many people doing deals on their phones that actually they have seen an increase in collisions between cyclists and pedestrians who just step off the pavement without looking. So there are, you would solve one problem, but then you find others. And fundamentally, we have to change the behaviour of people on streets. As I said before, consideration of various users of the street space, very important. And I think, particularly in areas like this, change the way that goods are delivered through the city. So an awful lot of the vans, we're on Saturday so you don't see many vans, but normally lots of vans delivering stuff here, that could all be done by cycle couriers very easily. The actual size of each delivery is relatively small.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Peter Murray OBE, we've travelled from Westminster to Bank, and we've inspected the cycle infrastructure. I say it was surprisingly good, despite some really hairy bits along the way. What was your experience? What would you give it out of 10? What do you think?
Well, I would say 7 out of 10 actually, because
it's good, generous rating.
You have some really good bits, and then you hit bits like the Aldwych, which doesn't work, and I think that is the story of London. It does. And
maybe that'll be the focus of another one of these. And certainly, like you said, the two bits where we did experience obstacles here and at Aldwych, big changes on the way. So yeah, it's going to be a lot better. Peter, it's been an immense pleasure cycling with you today. I hope we can do more of these in the future. Cheers.
Very enjoyable. Thank you very much.
I get to sit on the bench. The cool LFA bench.
Yeah, we can sit on the bench together.
Yeah. We get to sit on the bench. There's a lovely bit of it.